Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today I am returning to the National Archives in Washington, D.C. to visit the David M. Rubenstein Gallery and explore an exhibit called Records of Rights. This permanent display dives deep into the long and ongoing fight for equal rights in America, highlighting the stories of African Americans, women, and immigrants who have had to push to make the Constitution live up to its promises. I'll admit, when I first walked in, I was expecting to see a rundown of all 27 amendments to the Constitution, especially since this is the National Archives where the Constitution itself is housed just upstairs. I may have overpromised in yesterday's video, and I have returned to under-deliver today. I quickly learned this exhibit isn't structured around every single amendment, unfortunately, but instead it zooms in on a few of the biggest social movements in America and the people who have helped lead them. Even without covering all 27 amendments, this gallery still offers a powerful reminder that the story of rights in America is still being written. From voting rights to civil rights to immigration and beyond, the struggle for inclusion has always been a part of who we are. I'm excited to share a closer look at this meaningful exhibit and share the experience with you. America's founding documents are icons of human liberty, but the ideals enshrined in those documents did not initially apply to all Americans. They were, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr., a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. In The Record of Rights, we will explore how generations sought to fulfill this promise of freedom. The founders debated, and Americans continue to debate issues such as citizenship, free speech, voting rights, and equal opportunity. The National Archives documents capture many of these controversies and illustrate how Americans have sought to fulfill the promise of those founding documents. This exhibit begins with a viewing of the Magna Carta, which I did share in yesterday's video. I'm resharing it today because I realized that this entire exhibit is based off the forward progression of freedom for all races, genders, and social walks of life, and this progression is building upon freedoms that the exhibit implies originated with this document. The Magna Carta was written by a group of 13th century barons to protect their rights and property against a tyrannical king. The document is concerned with many practical matters and specific grievances relevant to the feudal system under which they lived. The interests of the common man were hardly apparent in the minds of the men who brokered the agreement, but there are two principles expressed in Magna Carta that resonate to this day. No free man shall be taken, imprisoned, disseized, outlawed, banished, or in any way destroyed, nor will we proceed against or prosecute him except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the Lord. To no one will we sell, to no one will be denied or delayed rights or justice. On June 15, 1215, in a field at Runnymede, King John affixed his seal to Magna Carta. Confronted by 40 rebellious barons, he consented to their demands in order to avoid civil war. Just 10 weeks later, Pope Innocent III nullified the agreement and England plunged into internal war. Although Magna Carta failed to resolve the conflict between King John and his barons, it was reissued several times after his death. On display, courtesy of David M. Rubenstein, is one of the 4 surviving originals of the 1297 Magna Carta. This version was entered into the official statute rolls of England. Centuries later, Magna Carta remains a powerful symbol of mankind's eternal struggle against oppression. Franklin D. Roosevelt, in his 1941 inaugural address, said, "The democratic aspiration is no mere recent phase in human history. It was written in the Magna Carta." On the eve of the American Revolution, Massachusetts adopted a seal depicting a soldier holding a sword in one hand and Magna Carta in the other. Magna Carta served to inspire and justify action in liberty's defense. The colonists believed they were entitled to the same rights as Englishmen, rights guaranteed in Magna Carta. They encoded those rights into the laws of their states and later into the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. Just as Magna Carta could not be overruled by the king, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The Fifth Amendment to the Constitution, which states, "No person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without the process of law," is a direct descendant of Magna Carta's guarantee of proceedings according to the law of the land. Citizens petition and protest, lawmakers draft bills, and courts make rulings. The passionate and continuous national debate about our rights is recorded in the original documents displayed here. In the 13th century, Magna Carta asserted in writing that fundamental rights exist and must be protected. More than 200 years ago, our revolutionary ancestors, influenced by Magna Carta, enshrined certain rights in our charters, which is the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution of the United States, and the Bill of Rights. The debate about our rights continues in public laws, constitutional amendments, executive orders, judicial decisions, and other records preserved in the National Archives. These records document the expansion and sometimes retraction of those rights. Shown here in this exhibit, Records of Rights, are significant moments in the ongoing struggle to define our rights recorded in those original documents. This broadside copy of the joint resolution proposing 12 amendments to the Constitution was published in New Hampshire, the fifth state to ratify the Bill of Rights, on January 25, 1790. Virginia took the total over the 3/4 threshold with its ratification on December 15, 1791. 10 of the 12 proposed amendments were then appended to the Constitution. This broadside copy of the First Federal Congress's joint resolution of March 4, 1789, was published by George Jerry Osborne in 1790. During the Revolutionary War, African Americans joined the Continental Army to secure political freedom for the United States and their own freedom from slavery. Although some liberated themselves through military service, the institution of slavery remained intact. During the Civil War, thousands of African Americans joined the Union Army, again with the goal of gaining freedom from slavery for themselves, family members, and other enslaved people. But for generations, Americans of African descent were barred from exercising the rights guaranteed to all citizens, and our nation wrestled with the conflict between the promise of freedom and the realities of slavery and racial discrimination. Through these documents, this exhibit shows the struggles to ensure full equality of African Americans and to live up to the nation's ideals. Cato Green, captured in Guinea, Africa, and sold into slavery in Rhode Island, fought in the Revolutionary War to obtain his freedom. Green's discharge papers record that he served in Rhode Island regiments for 5 years and was discharged from the Continental Army in 1783 by General George Washington. Green died in 1826 at the age of 86. Here are his discharge papers as Private Cato Green from June 5, 1783, and a pension affidavit that he submitted on June 6, 1820. Ironically, the capital of our democratic nation was built largely by enslaved people. Constructing the new city required a great deal of labor. White laborers were in somewhat short supply, but enslaved Africans were relatively abundant. Hired out by their owners to the commissioners of the District of Columbia, slaves helped construct both the U.S. Capitol and the White House. They served as bricklayers, quarry workers, sawyers, and more. The Capitol could not have been built without them. The Capitol's dome was adorned with the Statue of Freedom on December 2, 1863. Philip Reed, while enslaved, had devised the means by which the statue's plaster mold could be cast in bronze. Reed gained his freedom through the District of Columbia Compensated Emancipation Act of April 1862. Here is a voucher for a slave who worked on the White House paid to James Claggett, the slave's owner, in 1794, and also a promissory note from commissioners of the Federal District to Jasper Jackson for slave labor on the Capitol from July 13, 1795. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Despite these famous words in the Declaration of Independence, all Americans were not treated equally when that founding document was written. Thousands of men and women brought here against their will from Africa remained enslaved. This list of slaves owned by the Newcomb family of Virginia is from their family Bible. Included is the birth of Arinia Curtis on February 15, 1809, just weeks before James Madison, one of the chief architects of the Constitution, took office as president. This is the view from the east front of the President's house with the addition of north and south porticos circa 1807. This is the office of slave traders Price, Birch and Company in Alexandria, Virginia, circa 1862. On April 16, 1862, Congress passed the Act for the Release of Certain Persons Held to Service or Labor in the District of Columbia. This bill ended slavery in the district and provided for compensation to its slave owners who were loyal to the Union and who emancipated their slaves. 12 days later, Quentin Barker, a district resident, submitted this list of his slaves: Amanda Wallace and her 5 children, Ellen, Joanna, Elizabeth, Emmeline, and Winna. This is the celebration of abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia on April 19, 1866. The 13th Amendment ultimately brought an end to slavery in the United States. But prior to its ratification in 1865, enslaved people found other routes to freedom. Some escaped, some staged armed revolts, others purchased their freedom with money that they had earned or been allowed to keep. Still others were freed through the will of a deceased owner. In anticipation of large numbers of newly freed blacks flocking to Washington, D.C., the federal government established a Freedman's Village. The plan was for a temporary settlement providing housing and work to assimilate the freed men. The reality was a semi-permanent home in Arlington, Virginia for hundreds of people from 1863 until 1900. Others escaped from slavery and headed even further north, as did Georgia-born Fremont Adams to Brooklyn, New York. As his compiled military service records indicate, he came to the North for the purpose of enlisting in the Union Army. Adams enlisted as a private in the 1st U.S. Colored Cavalry on March 23, 1865. When Elijah King lost an arm after a gunpowder explosion, his owner, Caldwell Carr of Virginia, freed him. King bought produce in Virginia and sold it in the District of Columbia. As this 1857 list shows, he ultimately acquired substantial property on 17th Street. After 2 African American soldiers stationed at Camp Funston, Kansas, visited a local theater in February 1918, Major General C.C. Bayou issued Bulletin 35, stating that colored members of his command should refrain from going where their presence will be resented. In this 1918 letter to President Woodrow Wilson, journalist Ida B. Wells Barnett criticized the vicious and undemocratic bulletin. This is a photograph of African American men about to leave for Fort Funston, Kansas for military training. On February 1, 1864, Dr. Alexander T. Augusta, an African American doctor in the Union Army, attempted to board a Washington, D.C. streetcar. The conductor ejected Augusta because he said it was against the rules for colored persons to ride inside. In this letter to C.A. Dana, Assistant Secretary of War, Augusta describes the outrage committed against him by the conductor of car number 32 of the City Railway Company. In the 1890s, some states began passing laws limiting the rights of African Americans. Voting restrictions increased during the first half of the 1900s. Poll taxes discriminated against poor blacks. Understanding tests required prospective black voters to correctly interpret a section of the U.S. or state constitution. African Americans were not allowed to vote in primaries. States also segregated African Americans into separate and unequal public facilities. In its 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson decision, the Supreme Court ruled that Louisiana's racially designated train cars were unconstitutional. By World War I, the so-called Jim Crow laws segregated the races in restaurants, theaters, parks, and hospitals. In this 1908 letter, President Theodore Roosevelt informed the Justice Department that Nashville, Chattanooga, and St. Louis Railway Company was violating an Interstate Commerce Commission order to provide separate but equal accommodations to African Americans. Roosevelt said that accommodations furnished to colored persons are filthy and inadequate, and directed the Justice Department to enforce the ICC order. William Chappell, an editor for the African Methodist Episcopal Church, congratulated President Roosevelt for his action. Here we have President Roosevelt's letter from April 2, 1908, and the letter from William Chappell to Roosevelt on April 10, 1908. This sign was on a restaurant in Lancaster, Ohio in August of 1938. On May 2, 1944, Dr. Pleasant W. Good, Jr. of Mobile, Alabama, tried to vote in a primary election. He was turned away after being told that Negroes could not vote. In protest, he submitted this affidavit. This is a Louisiana affidavit regarding the denial of voter registration from 1872. This is a Republican ballot from 1872. This mural is a photograph of people waiting for the bus at the Memphis terminal, September 1943. These are participants in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. As head of the Florida National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, Harry T. Moore tirelessly protested lynchings and discrimination. He led a voter registration drive that added more than 100,000 African American voters. In 1951, on Christmas night, Moore's house was bombed, killing both him and his wife Harriet. The attack shocked many Americans. Among those who expressed their outrage was Carl Schubert of Reading, Pennsylvania, who insisted that President Harry S. Truman not let the murder go unsolved. Here we have a photograph of the bombed home of Harry T. Moore from December 25, 1951. On December 1, 1955, after a long work day, Rosa Parks took a seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. The driver instructed her and 3 other African American passengers to vacate their seats for white passengers. When Parks remained seated, the bus driver called the police, who arrested and fingerprinted her. Afterwards, Montgomery's Women's Political Caucus called for a one-day boycott of city buses. The boycott lasted for more than a year. This February 24, 1956 report describes progress 11 weeks into the boycott. On December 20, 1956, the Supreme Court ordered Montgomery buses desegregated. The struggle to secure the civil rights of African Americans began in the 18th century with the Revolutionary War soldiers fighting for their freedom and continued into the 19th century with anti-slavery petitions. In the 20th century, the struggle gained momentum with the formation of civil rights organizations. During the 1950s and 60s, Sit-ins, boycotts, and court challenges to segregation gradually dissolved the legal underpinnings for racial discrimination. Today, challenges persist and Americans continue to struggle to form that more perfect union. On March 7, 1965, John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and Hosea Williams of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference led a voting rights march from Selma to Montgomery, Alabama. State troopers attacked the marchers with bullwhips, clubs, and tear gas. Lewis was among the 58 people who were injured. Mrs. E. Jackson of Brooklyn, New York, wrote this letter to her congressional representative asking him to help those poor, innocent people. Hundreds of thousands of Americans gathered around the Lincoln Memorial to call for racial justice at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. As this program details, Marian Anderson sang, and leaders such as A. Philip Randolph, Mrs. Medgar Evers, James Farmer, and Martin Luther King Jr. gave speeches. These people attended the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. The next exhibit is about the complicated history of rights for women. Before 1920, a handful of states allowed American women full voting rights equal to those of men. Most women, however, were excluded from voting. The woman suffrage movement weathered deep schisms on how full suffrage could best be secured, through the states or through a constitutional amendment. However, by 1916, all major suffrage organizations supported an amendment. On August 18, 1920, after decades of organizing, petitioning, marching, staging hunger strikes, and holding silent vigils, a 3/4 majority of the states had ratified the 19th Amendment, extending full voting rights to women. Yet, full enfranchisement was not a reality, and many women remained voteless because of discriminatory law. Anne Ulrichs, resident of Washington, D.C. and mother of 2 infant daughters, was abandoned by her husband. As a married woman, however, her legal status remained tied to her husband's. She could not sign contracts, own property, or claim wages that she earned. In 1804, she petitioned Congress to grant her a divorce and give her her independence. Amelia Bloomer resented the fact that she owned property on which she was being taxed without representation. She petitioned Congress to either relieve her from that burden of taxation or grant her the right to vote. Bloomer was living in Iowa at the time, but spent most of her life in New York, where she was the one to introduce Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton to one another. Amelia became associated with loose-fitting trousers known as bloomers. The photo of her was taken in 1852. Before the Equal Credit Opportunity Act passed in 1974, it was difficult for married women to get credit in their own names. When applying for a loan, they could be asked about their intent to bear children or about their birth control practices. Even tennis champion Billie Jean King, who supported her household with her ample winnings and put her husband through law school, could not get a credit card in her own name. This is the 1974 Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which made it illegal for creditors to discriminate against applicants based on sex or marital status. Margaret Sanger, a nurse whose mother was pregnant 18 times in 22 years, coined the term birth control and dedicated herself to the women's rights struggle. In 1916, she was arrested in New York for advocating and disseminating information about birth control. These two letters ended up with the Children's Bureau the following year. One requests statistics to defend Sanger, the other seeks information to combat birth control. The first letter is to the Secretary of State from Reverend G.W. Huddleston, asking for literature to expose the evils of birth control from January 24, 1917. The second is a letter to Anne Rochester of the Children's Bureau from Jonah Goldstein, requesting information on birth control after Margaret Sanger's arrest March 24, 1917. These are passerbys looking at a window display at the headquarters of the National Association Opposed to Woman Suffrage 1919. This 1917 letter from the National Association Opposed to Woman Suffrage spells out its arguments against women being allowed to vote. They include states' rights, the threat of socialism, and the warning that granting women the right to vote would be an official endorsement of nagging as a national policy. This leaflet, titled The Nonsense of It, written by abolitionist Thomas Wentworth Higginson and circulated in 1865, presented a rebuttal to common anti-suffrage arguments and perceptions that defined women's roles and behavior during the 19th century. Among these arguments were such concepts as women are sufficiently represented already, or entirely distinct from men, also women are just silly creatures. This is Alice Paul and others at the National Woman's Party headquarters after ratification of the 19th Amendment on August 18, 1920. This is a suffragist picketing the White House holding a banner referring to President Woodrow Wilson as Kaiser in 1917. This printed petition pleads for Congress to recognize that all discriminations on account of sex or race may be removed. Founded in 1866 by Frederick Douglass, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Susan B. Anthony, the American Equal Rights Association demanded universal suffrage. However, as tensions grew between African American and women's rights activists, the group disbanded just a few years later. In 1876, on behalf of the National Woman Suffrage Association, women rights activists Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton signed this appeal to dedicate the nation's second century to securing justice for women. It asked women to gather signatures and send them in to make the largest petition ever. In January of 1917, members of the National Women's Party, led by Alice Paul, began picketing outside the White House in support of women's suffrage. They were the first political activists to picket the White House. They were arrested and imprisoned in Virginia's Occoquan workhouse. While in jail, many were mistreated. Some went on hunger strikes and were force-fed food. Women in the United States were not granted the right to vote until 1920. Nevertheless, as evidenced here, women were organizing and petitioning for equal rights since the country was first founded. In the process, they redefined the opening words of the U.S. Constitution, "We the people," to include both sexes. This is the repatriation oath of Leocadia Tesmer, dated December 5, 1941. Leocadia was born in Howard County, Nebraska, but lost her American citizenship when she married August Tesmer of Germany in 1909. It was reinstated 33 years later based on the Nationality Act of 1940. This is the repatriation oath of Belle Roebuck Olsofka, dated December 9, 1942. Belle was born in Columbus, Nebraska in 1898, but lost her American citizenship when she married Stanley Joseph Olsofka of Poland in 1919. It was reinstated in 1943. This unidentified woman is wearing a Stop Era badge at the National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas, 1977. Here are First Ladies Rosalind Carter, Betty Ford, and Lady Bird Johnson at the National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas, 1977. In 1923, Susan B. Anthony's nephew, Congressman Daniel R. Anthony, introduced H.J. Res. 75, proposing an Equal Rights Amendment known as ERA. Drafted by Alice Paul, the ERA sparked a long and divisive struggle. It was finally sent to the states for ratification in 1972, but was not ratified within the required time. Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman to serve in Congress, devoted her time in office to fighting for rights of Blacks and women. She said in 1971, "I am deeply concerned about the hearings currently being held for the Status of Women report. Many of these people who are asking to testify, especially the younger women, have never had an opportunity to express their views." One opponent to the amendment was Florence Kelley, a supporter of women's suffrage who spent decades chipping away at the inequalities women faced in the workplace. Kelley was concerned that the ERA would wipe away gains made on behalf of women through specific pieces of labor legislation that had improved and protected women's status. This brochure, circulated by the National Committee to Defeat the Unequal Rights Amendment, charged that the ERA was vague and legally unsound, unnecessary, and dangerous. It is from 1945. This is a photo of the relay in Seneca Falls, New York, the site of the first Women's Rights Convention, to the National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas, 1977. More than 130,000 people, including the 3 First Ladies, several Congresswomen, and Coretta Scott King, attended the National Women's Conference in Houston, Texas in 1977. Topics included childcare, abortion, gay and lesbian rights, and the ERA. The outcome was a national plan of action for women's rights that is still being debated to this day. A counter-conference led by Phyllis Schlafly, a lawyer and activist, was held across town and attracted approximately 30,000 people. This is lawyer and women rights activist Florence Kennedy addressing a rally for equal rights in 1972. This document shows that Representative Howard Smith of Virginia introduced the word sex despite his previous opposition to the bill. Historians still debate his motives, but his actions resulted in sweeping change. The U.S. Equal Employment Opportunity Commission characterized the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as the most comprehensive and important of all federal and state laws prohibiting employment discrimination. Passed as part of the Education Amendments of 1972, Title IX prohibited sex discrimination in education programs supported by federal dollars. The number of girls playing sports in high school and college soon quintupled. Although Title IX guaranteed equal opportunity, it did not guarantee equal spending, as seen in the highlighted text. In the 1860s, supporters for woman suffrage began to pressure Congress for the right to vote. The first woman suffrage amendment was introduced in Congress in 1878, and for the next 49 years, it was reintroduced regularly, becoming popularly known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. Finally, in 1919, Congress passed the 19th Amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote, which 3/4 of the states ratified by August 18, 1920. Some felt that the next step was full equality under the law. The first Equal Rights Amendment was proposed 3 years later. Drafted by Alice Paul, a leader in the fight for women's rights, the Equal Rights Amendment, ERA, was introduced in Congress in 1923 as a way to end discrimination against women. The controversial amendment was reintroduced at every subsequent session of Congress for 49 years. Supporters believed it would provide full equality for women. Opponents considered it unnecessary, and some believed it destructive of the family. In 1972, the amendment passed both houses of Congress and was sent to the states for ratification. When the extended deadline for ratification arrived in 1982, the amendment was 3 states short of the requisite number of votes. The First Amendment guarantees all citizens the right to petition Congress about a particular cause, issue, or grievance. During the 19th century, it was considered indecent for women to speak in public to a group, although some overcame this obstacle, and women often used their constitutional right to petition to express their views. These 2 petitions demonstrate how women tried to influence policy through written declarations about issues that mattered to them. The 1884 pro-suffrage petition from Jefferson Township, Ohio, distinguished voters from women. The 1917 petition from the Women Voters Anti-Suffrage Party of New York urged the Senate to pass no measure involving such a radical change in the government while the nation was at war. The 20th century brought dramatic increase in the number of working women and in the types of jobs that they held, opportunities created by 2 world wars and economic necessity. This next exhibit discovers, through photographs and documents, examples of women in the workplace and their struggle for the most optimal conditions. Statistically, minority women, both single and married, were more likely to seek employment outside the home than were white women. Their options were often restricted to factory or domestic work, and workplace conditions were often substandard. The factory jobs here show examples of poor working conditions. Lieutenant Harriet Ida Pickens and E.N.S. Frances Wills, shown here in December 1944, were the first African American women accepted for voluntary emergency service to be commissioned. Both were in the final graduating class of the Naval Reserve Midshipmen's School in Massachusetts. World War II created unprecedented opportunities for women to find work or secure better jobs. The need for nurses, factory workers, and other positions to support the war effort allowed more women than ever before to be in the workforce. This War Department pamphlet was circulated to guide supervisors in adapting women to the workforce. It's from 1943. Also, we have a letter sent on behalf of Mexican citizen Graciela Arroz. Although Mexican males qualified for U.S. military service, the law creating the Women's Army Corps provided for the enlistment of American citizens only. When Lilly Ledbetter discovered that she made 71% of what her male counterparts made, she filed a lawsuit that ultimately went to the Supreme Court. On January 29, 2009, President Obama signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which reset the statute of limitations for filing an equal pay lawsuit with each new discriminatory paycheck. This is the first equal pay bill proposed to Congress on June 19, 1944.
The issue of child care is no longer one of choice for wealthy women. It's a matter of necessity for all women. I move to substitute the following resolution for the IWY resolution. God-given responsibility and privilege of parents, non-negotiable. And whereas federally controlled early childhood development programs empower the government to choose the ideology by which young lives are molded. We are now going to vote on the main motion on child care. All those in favor of the resolution as it appears before you, please rise.
The final piece of this exhibit is titled Learning to Breathe Free and specifically talks about the challenges faced with immigration to the United States. The U.S. is often described as a nation of nothing but immigrants. People from around the globe have been drawn here, creating a diverse, dynamic culture and a wealthy, democratic nation. But at the same time, debates about the rights of newcomers have occurred ever since the nation was first founded. Records created by Congress, government officials, private groups, and immigrants themselves are now preserved at the National Archives and document these recurring questions and conflicts. Conducted every 10 years, the U.S. Census collects details about all people living in the United States, including members of immigrant communities. Its pages provide a wealth of information for genealogists tracing family ties and for historians attempting to reconstruct the lives and settlement patterns of different immigrant groups. Gold was first discovered in California in 1848, 2 years before the census record was taken there. This page notes the location of the gold as Township Number 1 because the town sprang up so quickly it had not been named yet. Census takers noted the great diversity of residents' birthplaces, including Chile, Mexico, England, Italy, France, Switzerland, Norway, Brazil, and various U.S. states. In 1912, immigration authorities ordered the deportation of 5 Syrian laborers, claiming they believed in taking multiple wives and would be unable to support themselves. This lawyer's handwritten petition argues that the men were healthy and strong and had thrifty and industrious relatives willing to post bonds to ensure they did not become public charges. It also states that the men did not understand the examiner's questions, and in fact the doctrines of polygamy are abhorrent to them. But the decision to deport the 5 men was upheld. Whenever travelers entered the United States, filed for citizenship, or engaged in court actions, that left official records behind. For many, the government accumulated extensive files of memos, interviews, correspondence, photographs, and forms documenting detentions, alien registrations, citizenship proceedings, and legal challenges. These case files provide historians and genealogists with detailed stories of individuals whose rights were challenged or defended. In 1862, during the Civil War, Secretary of State William Seward issued this circular to U.S. diplomatic posts, encouraging them to make it known that the United States welcomed the industrious laboring man and artisans. Foreign-born men made up a large proportion of the Union Army, and aliens staked claims for land under the Homestead Act. To persuade immigrants to come to America, steamship companies routinely printed ads celebrating the wonders newcomers would find here. This ad, printed in the Ottoman Empire around 1909, describes Texas as a labor paradise where, without any references and intermediation, anybody can at once obtain work and money. The American Immigrant Company, a private firm that promoted European immigration to the western United States, published a pamphlet to attract Swedish immigrants. It included ads like this one from the Wyoming Development Company promising 60,000 acres of first-class farmland. These are refugees from the failed Hungarian Revolution on an airplane flying to the United States in 1957. This is a passenger ship boarding pass for Chen Shi in 1911. This is a second-class certificate for Francesco Carasanuto from Transatlantic Italiano, April 14, 1926. The Eisenhower administration established the President's Committee for Hungarian Refugee Relief after the Soviet military crushed a Hungarian reform movement in 1956. As this memo describes, the committee provided temporary housing at an old New Jersey Army base. More than 200,000 Hungarian refugees settled in Europe, Australia, South and Central America, and the United States. In April 1980, President Fidel Castro permitted Cubans to leave for the United States from the port of Mariel, leading to an exodus of over 130,000 people. This Coast Guard incident memo is among the earliest reports on the boat lift, which became controversial in the United States when Castro added prisoners, addicts, the mentally challenged, and homosexuals to the exodus. This Austro-Americana and Fratelli Cosmic steamship poster advertised a Trieste, New York voyage in 1910. As immigration from Europe grew during the 1830s and 40s, an anti-immigrant movement became increasingly vocal about fears that newly arrived foreigners would remain loyal to European rulers and would undermine American democratic institutions. This petition from citizens of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, urged Congress to lengthen the waiting time before an immigrant could vote to 21 years. This poster from 1922 says in Polish, "The United States government and the public schools are helping our foreign-born friends who are applicants for American citizenship to learn our language and the principles of our government in preparation for good citizenship." New immigrants in the United States first had to successfully negotiate the process of landing and entering the country. Once admitted, they found that attitudes towards newcomers varied and ranged from sincere offers to help learn a language, get a job, or become a citizen, to outright hostility. These are Mexican farm workers registering for the Bracero program, which supplied agricultural workers to U.S. agriculture during and after World War II. In the early 20th century, some companies offered language and citizenship classes, vocational education, and social work to help newcomers assimilate. In Pennsylvania, the Chester Shipbuilding Company published this special Americanization number for its in-house magazine in 1919. During the 1920s, the YMCA developed a new English system for new American citizens, a curriculum that combined English language exercises with lessons in American history and government. During the Great Depression, the Immigration and Naturalization Service received many complaints, including this 1934 telegram that Mexican workers were taking jobs from American workers. A 1943 telegram to the Commissioner of Immigration, however, claims that Mexican laborers were absolutely necessary to harvest vitally essential war crops during World War II because of wartime labor shortages. Next, we are talking about the Chinese Exclusion Act, which I know is terribly hard to read with the glare on this glass. During the 1850s, Chinese laborers first came to the United States in large numbers to build the Transcontinental Railroad. By the late 1880s, racism and fear of job competition fostered a vocal anti-Chinese movement in the western part of the country. In response, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which stipulated that most Chinese could not enter the United States there were exceptions for diplomats, merchants, students, and tourists, and that Chinese not born in the United States could not become citizens. Virtually all immigration from China stopped. The act was repealed in 1943. Holding high the flame of hope in New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty has welcomed generations of immigrants and become an icon for freedom. Designed by Frederick Auguste Bertholdi, Liberty Enlightening the World was a gift of friendship from the people of France to the people of the United States. This deed of gift marked the statue's presentation on July 4, 1884 in Paris, France. At the statue's base, Emma Lazarus's poem, The New Colossus, speaks of the huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The Naturalization Act of 1790 allowed free white persons who had lived in the United States for 2 years and in a particular state for 1 year to apply for citizenship. A person of good character could take an oath and become a citizen. Children of naturalized citizens under age 21 were considered citizens, but their citizenship did not mean they could vote. Later, Chinese and eventually other Asians were categorized as non-white and thus ineligible for citizenship. During our nation's early years, states and cities enacted most immigration regulation. After the Civil War, however, a series of Supreme Court rulings gave increased responsibility to the federal government to control immigration. As millions of people from around the world poured into the United States, Congress passed laws, approved processes, and established agencies to distinguish desirable from undesirable immigrants, to control who entered the country, and to determine who could become a citizen and who would remain an alien. In this 1904 letter to the Commissioner General of Immigration, the Secretary of the Immigration Restrictive League argued that a literacy test is by far the best additional means of selecting who could enter the United States. The Immigration Act of 1917 required prospective immigrants to read a passage in any of several languages. As detailed in this 1910 notice, individuals prohibited from entering the United States included idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, and epileptics, as well as criminals, polygamists, and anarchists. Also excluded were paupers and persons likely to become a public charge. Written for use at Ellis Island, the notice was revised for the Galveston, Texas immigration station. In 1910, the U.S. Immigration Service opened a new facility for processing immigrants arriving in San Francisco. The Chinese community objected that Angel Island's location made it difficult to visit relatives and that inspectors were exceedingly harsh towards Chinese. This handbill asserted that we must with one accord protest for the equal rights which were enjoyed by us. In this 1890 petition, the North American Turner Bund, a German-American society, protested any and all the measures that would change current immigration laws. They feared that the new laws would limit immigration from their homeland. Despite the petition, the next year Congress passed legislation that established the Immigration Service and expanded the list of who could be refused entrance. After the United States declared war on Japan in 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, creating zones from which any or all persons may be excluded, the justification for evacuating and incarcerating about 120,000 citizens and non-citizens of Japanese descent to camps away from the Pacific coast. This newspaper from an evacuation center in North Portland, Oregon, illustrates how internees tried to maintain normalcy. In 1941, about 127,000 Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans lived in the mainland United States. The president of the Japanese American Citizens League wrote the Immigration and Naturalization Service, offering assistance with educational programs inculcating to the foreign-born first generation an intimate and sincere appreciation for the things which make America great. Newcomers to America often settle among others from the same geographic or ethnic background. These communities provide an initial welcome, familiar faces, a common language, and a foundation from which to fight prejudice and build political influence. In 1798, fearing that immigrants might bring French revolutionary ideals to America, Congress passed a law extending the waiting time for becoming a citizen to 14 years. This 1802 petition from aliens residing in the county of Lancaster, Pennsylvania, protested that law. Congress repealed it later that year. A 1965 amendment to the Immigration Act of 1952 abolished the system of country-based immigration quotas. New provisions for family reunification encouraged a surge of immigration from Asia and Latin America. Political cartoonist Gibson Crockett, who saw the law's passage as a triumph that ended past discrimination, sent this cartoon to President Lyndon Johnson. Congressional efforts at crafting comprehensive immigration legislation during the early 1980s failed. In 1984 and 85, however, legislation including an amnesty program, agricultural provisions, and employer fines passed both the House and Senate. As this White House memorandum indicates, President Ronald Reagan signed the Immigration Reform and Control Act into law on November 6, 1986. The Immigration Act of 1924 imposed quotas by nationality to determine who could enter the United States. People from the Western Hemisphere were exempt. Few Southern and Eastern Europeans and more Northern and Western Europeans were permitted entry. The annual ceiling was lowered and visas with photographs were required. Alright everybody, I'm going to make this outro short. We have now seen everything in this exhibit. Thank you so much for joining me on this visit to the Records of Rights. I had such a great time here, even though it didn't cover every single amendment like I expected it would. I'm really glad we took the time to explore this. The stories of women, Black Americans, immigrants, and so many others remind me that the fight for rights has always been a part of America's history, and it is still ongoing. If there is anybody still here, I want to say thank you so much for being such a trooper and sticking with such a long video with me. I really want to show my appreciation, so I thought what I would do is get this postcard at the gift shop at the museum, and the first person who leaves a comment down below and says you would like to receive it, I would love to write you a little note of my appreciation and send it out to you. If you leave that comment, I will send you an email address that you can send me your mailing address, and I will be happy to send this to you.